I've spent a lot of time the last few weeks listening. Last night, the senator from Texas made a big point that members of Congress, in his opinion, were not listening to the American people. I have a lot of experience at listening as a physician. That's what I got paid to do. I think what Senator Cruz and some of his allies in the Senate, their motives are pure. Their tactics are tremendously erroneous in my opinion. But I want to draw a picture for you in a minute about this idea of listening and what it means. Even though I disagree with their tactics, I admire their spirit and their vigor. I've spent a lot of nights, having delivered 4,000 babies, I've had a lot of sleepless nights. I've gone 2 and 3 days with 2 or 3 hours of sleep over that period of time to care for people. But I would make this point. As a physician, the first thing you're taught in medical school is listen to your patient and they'll tell you what's wrong with them. And so you do have to spend time listening to our constituencies. But a doctor doesn't just listen to the patient. They observe the patient. They examine the patient. They do tests on the patient. And they can combine all that listening with all the other data they've collected. And then they make a decision about giving advice to that patient. They give what's called informed consent. And that's the big story that hadn't been told to the thousands and thousands of people from Oklahoma that have called my office. They've been given informed consent. They've been sold a bill of goods. And when I have young interns and young staff in my office taking significant calls from people who've been misled, there's no way you're going to talk them out of a position that outside interest groups and a very few, small number of people inside the Senate have planted. So I want to spend a few minutes addressing that. And I want to go back to the patient for a minute, because in my broad experience of treating everything from newborn babies to grandmas to broken bones to gallbladders to you name it, I've gained a little bit of experience on how you judge inputs of information. And what we've had outlined, and I want those people that call my office to listen to this. What we've had outlined is a group of people that said somebody has a terribly swollen knee, and if you don't fix it, they're not going to be able to walk. And then we got to fix it right now. Nothing else matters. We have to fix it right now. Except they have a staph infection in their knee. Methicillin-resistant staph infection in that knee. But because we don't listen to all the facts, and we didn't do all the studies, they don't recognize that staph infection has already infected the heart valve. And now the knee is the thing that's red and hot and what they're complaining about. But the good physician will do the test, the studies, the listen, the exam, and find out what the real problem is. And the staph infection in the knee came from a staph infection in the heart. And if, in fact, you don't go after treating the heart of the problem, doesn't matter if you cure the knee, the patient's going to be dead. And that's what we've had put upon us by some of my colleagues. They've been misdirected in terms of what the real problems are. You know, nobody fought harder, I would say, against the Affordable Care Act as a practicing physician than I did. I was still practicing being a U.S. Senator at that time. I was still delivering babies on the weekends in Oklahoma. Senator McCain said it was a fair process. It wasn't a fair process. The one bill that actually would have solved our health care problems never got a vote on the floor of the Senate. It's called the Patient's Choice Act. The majority leader wouldn't allow a vote on that amendment. It was a complete substitute. It actually fixed the real problems and did so without putting the government between you and your doctor. But let me go back. What Senator Reid the majority leader has said is right. What is the Affordable Care Act about? It's about ultimately getting to a single-payer system where the government controls all of health care. So Senator Cruz and Senator Lee aren't wrong about worrying about it, aren't wrong about wanting to change it. But we have a whole lot bigger problems than the Affordable Care Act. It's just one of them. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what this debate has taken our attention away from. The real problem in our country right now is that we're bankrupt. Our total unfunded obligations of the federal government are $124 trillion. The entire net worth of the entire country is only $94 trillion. We're $30 trillion in the hole and growing that hole. And what that means is we're leaving a legacy of pauperism and debtor's prison to our children and our grandchildren. So while we've had this big debate, nobody's focused on the fact that Washington's still lying about the numbers up here, including the bill that came across from the House. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through that so we can refocus on the infected heart instead of looking at the infected knee. So I'm very glad that they've raised the issue. The problem is we're double-minded and double-speaking when we talk about the numbers. And let me show you that just for a minute. Congress, the President, the House and the Senate voted for the Budget Control Act. We made a promise. We said we recognize we have some problems. The first thing we can do is we can start addressing some of those problems through discretionary spending. And you had all these claims that we made all these savings, over $2 trillion. Well, here's the real numbers. The real numbers are, in 2011, the base discretionary spending was $1.062 trillion. By the time you add up the emergency spending, the troop spending for the war, we spent $1.221 trillion. In 2012, as we worked this Budget Control Act through, the base spending was $1.043 trillion, real spending, and you add in everything else that we spent through emergencies and everything else, we spent $1.198 trillion. This is the discretionary spending. 2013, through the Budget Control Act, the base, according to that, was $988 billion. Through all the extra things that we allowed, in emergency spending, war spending, et cetera, we spent $1.145 trillion. Now, the estimate, according to the CBO, reading what the law is and the promise to the American people, is that this next year it's supposed to be $967 billion. And if you add what is expected in war and discretionary spending through emergencies, it's to be $1.14 trillion. So what have we done? By forcing a discussion about the wasteful spending, we have set us on a path to slowly actually cut actual discretionary spending. Something we're going to have to do if we're not going to have our kids in debtor's prison. So what is the bill that we have coming over here? The bill that we have coming over here is $985 billion. So it's $18 billion bigger than what we promised you just last year. And besides that, it's even $18 billion higher because we've got fake pay-fors in there. So it's actually $18 billion higher than that, and something what we call chimps, where we assume something that we've assumed the year before but didn't count. We used it the year before, and we'll count it again this year. So it's the type of accounting that anybody in a publicly held company in this country would go to jail for. They'd be convicted and go to jail. But what we agreed to in the Budget Control Act is 2014 would be the last year of discretionary cuts. And then every year after that, it'd rise by 2.5%, i.e. the estimated rate of inflation. And that we could change the mix and we could get there. But we're not doing that. And just to show the spending's still going to rise. The discretionary spending's still going to rise. Here it is in terms of baseline and actual. And you can see we're not cutting spending anymore after this year. It's going up. Which begs the question, what are we doing with this continuing resolution? We're breaking our word that we gave you last year and the year before. We're already fudging. We can't help ourselves. We're addicted. And you could say, well, as Nancy Pelosi has said, the minority leader in the other party, there's not anything else left to cut in discretionary spending. Of course, that belies the fact that the Government Accounting Office has listed 165 different sets of duplicative spending, wasteful duplicative spending, that's $250 billion a year, that if the Congress would do its job, you could save half of that. So you could be, instead of doing this, we could be doing this. What does that mean? That means your children have a brighter future. That means we don't waste money. We clean up the fraud and corruption in the federal government. That's what it means. There are points of order that can be raised against this bill, and I'm hopeful that we'll do it, because we violate the Budget Control Act. So if 60 senators want to say, we don't care what we promised you before, we got to spend more money, then they'll vote. They have to have 60 plus votes to waive that budget point of order. And I predict they probably will, because we can't help ourselves. I won't. But we're going to spend more money than what we just last year promised the American people we would do. And of course, that doesn't address any of the real problems that are facing our country, which are the mandatory programs. And I want to give you just a short flavor of some of the programs. And I'll just take green buildings, for example. Here is, and I'd ask unanimous consent to use an oversized chart on the floor.
Without objection.
If you just look at this, nobody in their right mind would create this. But of course, Congress isn't in its right mind. We wouldn't have a $750 billion deficit if we were in our right mind. Here it is for all the green building programs in the country. We have in this 9 different departments that are running multitude of programs that all do the same thing. Now, a cogent person would say, if it's good to have green building programs, why don't we have one? And why don't we create a czar of green building programs, put them in charge of it, and let's have one set of grants, one set of incentives, and one set of bureaucracy that runs it. But we haven't done that. So let me just go through for a moment this series of duplications that the Government Accountability Office has outlined, and just see if you think we're doing our job. See if you think we're doing the oversight that we should be doing. Here's the first group. We have 15 unmanned aerial aircraft programs, of which we're going to spend $37 billion over the next 5 years. Why do we have 15? Maybe we need one for each branch of the service, and they could subcontract out what they deliver to Homeland Security if we need those for Homeland Security or for the intelligence agencies. Why do we have 15? We have 18 different food programs running through 3 different agencies at $62 billion a year. We have 21 homeless programs, 7 different agencies. We're spending $2.9 billion. We have transportation services for the transportation disadvantaged person. We have 80 different programs in 8 different agencies, spending $2 billion a year. Job training and employment, we have 47 job training programs for the not disabled. We have 6 veteran job training programs, and we have over 50 job training programs for the disabled, spending $18 billion for the non-disabled, and a total of $21 billion combined. And what we did is the oversight in the state of Oklahoma to look at that. And what GAO says, just on this one particular one, is all of these programs overlap one another except for 3. So they all do the same thing, except there's no metrics on any of them to see if they're actually giving somebody a family stabilizing long-term job or the skills for a long-term job. We have 82 different teacher quality programs run by 10 different agencies, not at the Department of Education. We're spending $4 billion a year on it. Food safety, military veterans and health service, economic development, 80 different programs, $6.5 billion a year. I could go on. I won't bore you. There's 2 other pages full of it. 165 different sets of duplication, over $250 billion. And here's what Congress has done with it. We've addressed 8% of it. 8%. There's been hearings. That doesn't mean we've had an answer for it. We've addressed 8% of it. So when you look at Congress's activity of doing real oversight, to really solve the problems, to really eliminate duplication, to really eliminate fraud, to really eliminate waste, most members of Congress aren't interested in doing that. They don't get the glory. But it's our oath. It's our responsibility to do that, yet we fail to do it. I heard the senator from Virginia mention the debt limit. I'm going to say again something I said in 2009. We don't have an income problem in this government. We have a spending problem. Do you realize the average American spends 1/4 of their life working to fund the federal government? Now think about that for a minute. You're going to spend 1/4 of your life working to fund. If you count the unfunded liabilities that we have, and you count the 25% of GDP where we are on spending today, you're going to spend 1/4 of your life funding. Now, if I remember correctly, and I read the Constitution correctly, this little book, what our founders talked about was a limited government. Not a government that consumes 25% of your labor to run it. Not a government that ignores the 10th Amendment or ignores the enumerated powers. You know, it's interesting. I introduced the Enumerated Powers Act. It's a very simple act. It has 37 co-sponsors. And what it says is before you introduce a bill on the floor of the Senate, you have to reference the area of the Constitution that gives you the authority to legislate in that area. And sad to say, I couldn't get any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join on that one very simple bill that would help us bring us back to what our founders thought about a limited government and the responsibility. Our government's limited only to the extent at which it can borrow right now. We have tons of structural deficits in our economy today. We have a job deficit in terms of creating jobs. We have a skills deficit in terms of matching those skills to the jobs that are available. We have a demand deficit because of the overbearing and overreach of the federal government and the regulation that is imposed upon the citizenry. We have a deficit of watching out for those that can't watch out for themselves. We have programs that are supposed to do it. But when you go back and read our founders' vision, and you read the Federalist Papers, and you read what this most wonderful government that's ever been created was designed to do, first and foremost, it was designed to be limited because our founders knew that when it became 25% of your labor, your liberty was diminished. Your freedom was diminished. And of course, that ultimately is what the fight is over the Affordable Care Act. It's what will it ultimately cost? And how much freedom will you have as we give you something that some need? What will you give up to receive that? So I'll end with just the following. I think there's 4 questions that the American people ought to be asking the members of Congress right now. 4 critical questions. And I would tell you, I think too often we fail in answering these questions. Here they are. Are you leading in such a way as to restore confidence in ourselves, our government, and our institutions? Are you trying to unite us, or are you trying to divide us? I already described we're bankrupt. How do we get out of it? The only way we get out of it is working, coming together. Real leadership that draws us together and says, hey, folks, there's no finger pointing here. There's lots of mistakes been made. How do we solve these problems? And how do we do it together without making somebody else look bad? How do we restore the confidence that we know we're going through? I want to tell you a story. I did town hall meetings during August, and I went to a town, Miami, Oklahoma. And there's a wonderful plant there that grows mushrooms and vegetables. It's a big operation. And came to my town hall meeting was the owner of that plant. His name's Virgil Juergensmeyer. He's probably my age or maybe a little older. And he said, Tom, I'm spending $60,000 to $70,000 a month buying from my competitors right now to fill my order. I could create a couple of hundred jobs in Miami. It's not a big city. But I don't have the confidence in the future of our country right now to invest $5 million and go to the bank and borrow that to create these jobs because I don't think we got it together as a country anymore. Now, he's not partisan. I don't know what his political leanings are. But what I do know is he's lost confidence. And that's happening all across our country right now because we don't have leadership that does anything except point out what's wrong with the other side. What we need is leadership that brings us together, that compromises, that works to identify and solve the problems. The second question that I think ought to be asked is, are you more interested in the short-term political gain as a legislator than you are the long-term problems of this country? I'm a term-limited senator. I set my term limit when I first ran. I have a little over 3 years to go. I'll never run for another office the rest of my life. And I'd like to think that most of my thought has been about long-term since I've been in the Senate, not short-term, of actually solving problems, the long-term problems, not the short-term problems. I talked about our structural deficit. We have to get after it. We have to get after it now. And if you look at the political dynamic, right now is the only time between now and the next presidential election that it will be positive for Republicans and Democrats to join hands together to solve the problems with Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and our structural deficit. We have less than 3.5 months to come to an agreement to do that. Because the political dynamics will never allow that to happen again until after the next presidential election. Because everybody will be pointing fingers. Wouldn't it be nice if we had the leadership that said, Republicans and Democrats come together, compromise, fix these problems. Even if you lose your election, fix the problem for the country. Fix the problem for the children. Fix the problem for our grandchildren. But the selfishness of careerism drives us to do what is politically expedient and what is popular rather than what is right. The third question, are you willing to look at this institution of government and ensure that we're not wasting, duplicating, or being defrauded in the programs that we authorize through a congressional continuing resolution? And the answer to that question is we're being defrauded every day. We have waste every day that we're not working on, and we have duplication like crazy from the GAO that we're not even attempting. I have to give my hat off to the president. If you look at his budget, he took more of the GAO recommendations that they made and put them into his budget than we've even considered in both the House and the Senate. At least he's listening to some. They actually acted on it in his budget for the fiscal year 2014. The question really on this third question is, do you have the political courage to fix what's wrong and compromise on the solutions to fix what's wrong? The GAO has told us what's wrong, and yet we fail to address it. And then finally, and maybe this is more of an Oklahoma thing, I hope not, but do you actually believe what the Constitution says about a limited role for the federal government? And will you vote to ensure that the 10th Amendment that our founders added is brought to date, is revered? And unfortunately, that's hardly ever a concern in the U.S. Senate. I've been here over 9 years. We don't worry about the enumerated powers. We want to fix things. And in our good desire to fix things, we trample the Constitution. And so now we're $17 trillion in debt. We have $124 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And that is growing every day. So the one thing that this debate that we've had the last few days in the Senate has caused us to not focus on is the very thing that is the real problem facing this country. And it's ineffective leadership. It's fixing the wrong problem. It's the heart, not the knee. It's the heart that's infected. And we have to address fixing the heart before we can ever hope to cure the knee. Mr. President, I thank you for your patience, and I thank the Senator from Missouri for his patience. We don't have one problem in front of this nation we can't fix. If we restored confidence, we'd be growing at 4% a year right now. If people had the hope that we were going to do what was right, not what was expedient, what was right, what was in the best long-term interest of us all, not me, not Republicans, not Democrats, but us all, and we had that kind of leadership, we'd get out of our funk, we'd get out of our debt, and we'd be the America that we had when I was growing up. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.